I arrived at the Bell Foundation Gala wearing the calm expression that had protected me for years. I had chosen the silver dress Vivian Bell's staff preferred, smiled at donors who knew me only as the dependable woman in the background, and told myself that being useful was still a kind of belonging. Then the lights dimmed, the brand documentary began, and the first sentence of the narrator's script split my chest open. At the launch of my future mother-in-law's luxury brand, I was quietly moved off the family stage while my fiance-ex, Sabrina Holt, was introduced as the woman who truly understood the Bell image. What the audience saw next was even worse. Images of the earliest school visits, cramped community rooms, handwritten planning boards, and the pilot campaign's first rough sketches flashed across the screen, while Sabrina was presented as the visionary who had built the program from the ground up. Applause moved through the ballroom in confused waves while I stood perfectly still. A staff member stepped to the illuminated donor wall beside the screen and, with the smoothness of a rehearsal, deactivated the brass plate that carried my name. The panel dimmed. Guests turned toward the wall, then toward me, trying to decide whether they had just witnessed a clerical correction or a family execution. Oliver Bell looked down at his champagne glass instead of at my face. Across the room, Vivian accepted congratulations as though the correction of history were an act of stewardship. In that instant, two questions took hold of the room and of me. Why had the family decided to erase me in public? And what truth had forced them to do it tonight instead of in private? The insult did not end with the screening. After the speeches, Vivian summoned me into the private dining room where the inner circle had already taken their seats. Crystal reflected the chandelier light. Every place card had been arranged. Every witness had been chosen. "Nora, you were never meant to speak for this family," Vivian said, not loudly, but with the confidence of a woman who expected silence to do half her work for her. She framed the moment as a course correction, claimed the foundation needed a cleaner public story, and implied that gratitude should make humiliation easier to swallow. When I asked why my name had been removed, instead of disgust, Vivian replied that discussion was what weak families did in front of donors. I could have screamed, but rage would have given them the scene they were prepared to dismiss. So I looked from Vivian to Oliver, saw fear where I had hoped to find shame, and understood that the evening had been engineered long before I arrived. Someone had recut the documentary. Someone had ordered the donor wall changed. Someone had chosen a public room. So I would feel that every future appeal for mercy would be heard by witnesses first. Then a small, stubborn memory rose above the shock. The storage case in my apartment still held my mother's creative diaries, original campaign sketches, and voice notes proving the brand's new flagship story had been built from her work and grief. I had kept them because I had never trusted the family to value the years before the cameras arrived. I left the dining room with the taste of metal in my mouth, and the knowledge that if they had built an entire spectacle to erase me, the proof I carried must be stronger than I had let myself believe. Years earlier, when the outreach program existed only as a stack of notes and one borrowed van, I had been the one visiting schools no donor wanted to tour. I wrote the first outreach plans by hand, persuaded exhausted principals to trust a family name they did not yet benefit from, and sat at kitchen tables with mothers who cared less about philanthropy language than about whether somebody would actually come back next week. The Bell patriarch loved to say that the family believed in service, but in practice he loved results that could be photographed and retold. Vivian loved polish. Oliver loved stages. I loved the work itself. And that made me the easiest person to hide behind once the work started succeeding. At first, invisibility had seemed temporary. The family told me that the public role would come later, after the foundation stabilized, after the donors grew familiar with the story, after the press cycle softened, after Oliver learned how to handle a microphone without sounding entitled. Later became a private joke. I told myself whenever another brochure quoted my research without naming me, whenever another gala seated me at the table, but introduced me as though I were simply reliable family support. I stayed because the program mattered to girls who had started planning their weeks around its visits. I stayed because leaving felt like abandoning people who had done nothing to me. I stayed because families teach women to call endurance loyalty until the day endurance becomes evidence against them. The first crack in the official story had opened months before the gala. A a donor from the pilot year, sent me a note asking why the new annual report credited campaign strategy to a consultancy that had not even existed when the launch materials were built. When I raised the discrepancy gently, Vivian answered with the polished irritation reserved for inconvenient truths. The report was being modernized, she said. The program had grown beyond its amateur phase. Personal attachment to early drafts was natural but childish. I let the matter drop in public. Yet I began paying attention to the subtle edits, missing names and captions, simplified timelines, and board decks that flattened 10 years of effort into a story tidy enough for television. After the gala, I returned to my apartment and pulled the old canvas case from the back of a closet. Inside were the notebooks I had kept during the first year, donor letters written before the family-employed communications teams, route maps, expense logs, printed emails from nights when I had begged the family office to cover fuel, and the creative diary my mother had left behind before she died. The pages smelled faintly of dust and toner. The handwriting was messier than I remembered. None of it looked glamorous enough for a documentary. All of it looked devastatingly real. For the first time that night, the humiliation in my body shifted shape. It remained pain, but it became usable pain, the kind that forces a woman to stop negotiating with people who have already chosen her place for her. At dawn, my phone lit up with a message from Lydia Chen, the operations director, who had watched me build the outreach program from its first school visit. Lydia did not waste words. She warned that someone from the family office had entered the digital archive after midnight and requested the earliest campaign files under a board review pretext. Another request had gone to facilities asking for access logs near the donor wall. None of that sounded like a family regretting an overreaction. It sounded like a family checking for leaks, sealing records, and making sure every witness understood which version of events would be rewarded. Lydia ended her message with a line that settled my thoughts into something colder than panic. If they are still cleaning, it means they know you have something they can't predict. Later that afternoon, I found myself replaying a memory I had spent years treating as harmless. In the program's second year, a television producer wanted to interview me on site after a visit to a school gymnasium. Vivian stepped in smiling, thanked the producer for supporting the cause, and explained that the family preferred to keep operational staff away from the public narrative while the brand matured. At the time, I had believed the decision was strategic. Now I recognized it as rehearsal. The family had not decided to erase me overnight. They had practiced reducing my visibility every time the work became too valuable to leave attached to the woman who had actually done it. The gala was only the first moment when the practice became impossible for outsiders to miss. What made that recognition hurt more was remembering the girls who had learned to look for me first whenever the van pulled into a school courtyard. They had called me by name, not by foundation title. They had trusted me because I returned calls, remembered siblings, and never treated their problems like props for fundraising dinners. That memory clarified something important. The family had not only stolen authorship from me, it had tried to convert care into brand equity, turning real labor and real loyalty into a polished inheritance asset. Once I named that theft correctly, my purpose sharpened again. I was not fighting for a line in a documentary. I was fighting against the old family habit of consuming a woman's usefulness and then presenting the remains as collective virtue. By noon, Oliver called and asked to meet without his mother. He chose a hotel lounge that specialized in discretion and began with the same exhausted tone he had used as a teenager after breaking something expensive. He said the gala had gone further than he expected. He said he had tried to soften it. He said the family was under pressure to simplify leadership before a major donor campaign. Then he asked the real question: would I sign a short statement praising the documentary and confirming that the program had always been a collective Bell family effort? He tried to package surrender as dignity, telling me the statement would protect everyone from speculation. I heard what he was truly offering. In return for helping them seal the lie, I could remain the invisible, useful woman they would continue to use when the cameras were off. I refused without raising my voice. The refusal changed his face. For 1 second, the practiced public air disappeared, and I saw the man who had grown comfortable receiving outcomes he had not earned. He asked whether I planned to embarrass the family. I answered that the family had already done that part. What I planned to do next was decide whether they would also keep the truth. On the ride home, I understood that the next stage would not be about persuading them to treat me fairly. It would be about surviving the retaliation that always follows when a woman steps out of the role designed for her. That evening, the retaliation arrived. My foundation access card failed. A driver from the family office left 2 sealed garment boxes outside my apartment door, as though the return of borrowed evening wear could symbolically return me to silence. Then a gossip columnist posted an item suggesting that I had stepped back from public work for personal recovery reasons while the family reorganized leadership. The lie was elegant because it sounded compassionate. It painted me as unstable without accusing anyone of cruelty. I read it twice, felt the insult settle into a familiar ache, and then opened one of the donor letters again. If they were already building the narrative that I had simply drifted away, then proof would not be enough. I would need timing, witnesses, and a stage they could not privately lock after I spoke. The next 2 days taught me how coordinated the family's defense had become. Files disappeared from shared drives. Staff who had once answered my messages within minutes suddenly wrote back with warm vagueness and no information. Invitations to planning meetings went out without my name. Even people who cared about me began speaking as though they were being overheard. Yet each act of pressure also revealed the structure of the lie. A truthful story does not require synchronized silence. A truthful board does not need to move a woman off every agenda before dawn. Every locked door and softened email confirmed that Vivian feared proof more than scandal. Lydia met me after hours in a parking garage because the office now felt unsafe. From a tote bag, she produced copies of metadata from the documentary edit history, showing that the earliest rough cut named me in captions and voiceover until a final night revision replaced me with Sabrina Holt. There were also internal comments from communications staff asking whether the donor wall could be aligned to final messaging before broadcast. Lydia apologized for not speaking sooner. I told her apology was wasted energy. What mattered was that the family had made a series of decisions, not a single emotional mistake. Decisions leave trails. Trails leave openings. For the first time since the gala, the betrayal looked less like a cloud over my life and more like a machine assembled by human hands. I spent the following morning revisiting early donors one by one, not to ask for rescue, but to test memory against the official narrative. An elderly pediatrician named Miriam Voss welcomed me into a sunlit townhouse kitchen and pulled out a framed photograph from the pilot year. There I was, hair tied back, whiteboard marker in hand, explaining the first outreach map to a room full of skeptical adults. There was no Sabrina, no board consultant, and no polished launch team. Dr. Voss remembered exactly who had convinced her to fund the first van and why. Because the young woman in front of her had known every family by name and every obstacle by cost. When Miriam said, "I invested because I believed you, not because I believed your surname," the sentence landed with the force of permission I had not realized I still craved. Vivian answered those donor visits with a second counterattack. At the next public family event, the board was told that outside consultants had modernized the outreach arm after an informal family phase became unsustainable. Oliver repeated the line smoothly enough that most attendees would have accepted it if they had not already heard from me or seen Lydia's documents. Worse, the family announced a new scholarship in honor of the founding women of the foundation, a phrase broad enough to sound generous and empty enough to exclude me by design. Watching the live stream from my apartment, I felt humiliation trying to become self-doubt again. The family was excellent at producing ceremonies that made erasure sound noble. If I let the performance continue uncontested, even honest witnesses would begin to wonder whether memory itself had become rude. That night, Oliver came to my apartment without warning. He looked less like an heir than a man who had spent 2 days pretending not to hear his conscience. He told me his mother was preparing a private settlement, a restored salary, a ceremonial title, perhaps even a quiet board acknowledgement at year-end. If only I would stop speaking to donors and release Lydia from any obligation to cooperate. The offer was almost tender in its calculation. It assumed that money, proximity, and the possibility of eventual recognition would still be enough to buy my patience. I listened until he ran out of rehearsed mercy, then asked a question he could not answer. If the truth helped the family, why was every proposed solution built around my silence? His face hardened. He accused me of threatening the very program I claimed to love. He said donors hated mess, teenagers needed stability, and public institutions could not survive family wars. For a moment, my old instincts flared. I nearly reassured him, nearly explained myself into smaller proportions so he would not feel accused. Then I realized that the family had always relied on that reflex. They harmed me first, and then drafted me into protecting them from the discomfort of knowing it. I told him the program deserved better than a mythology maintained by deleting the woman who created its earliest spine. If donors withdrew from truth, they had never been supporting the right thing anyway. He left angry, but beneath the anger I saw fear, not that I would lie, but that I would speak clearly enough for others to stop lying with him. The deeper I went, the uglier the pattern became. Board minutes had been amended after the fact. Early grant proposals referenced my field reports without naming the author. A celebratory magazine profile had lifted entire descriptions from donor letters I had written during the pilot year and placed them into the mouth of a consultant who had not joined the orbit until years later. None of those pieces alone would have toppled the family story. Together, they revealed a habit, and habits are what powerful families call culture when they do not want to call it theft. I did not merely have proof that a name had been removed from a wall. I had proof that the family had spent years training the public to accept my disappearance as natural. One of the most useful pieces came from a former documentary editor who had already left the foundation and no longer depended on the family for work. He agreed to meet only after Lydia vouched for me, and even then kept checking the cafe window, like a man who had once learned how expensive honesty could become. He told me the original cut had been built around my field footage and voice notes because those were the most emotionally credible materials in the archive. The order to remove me had come late, after a closed-door review led by Vivian. The editor remembered the exact phrase because it had bothered him. The audience must feel dynasty, not dependency. When I heard it, I understood that the family had never viewed me as a founder whose work gave the brand substance. They had viewed me as embarrassing proof that substance had existed before their preferred spokesperson. The pressure campaign escalated again the next morning. My landlord, who had always been friendly in a cautious way, called to say that the apartment owner intended to reassess the lease because the property had become linked to an emerging public controversy. The message was delivered politely, but the source was obvious. The family could not control the journals in my closet, so it reached for the ground beneath my feet. For a brief, ugly half hour, panic nearly broke my concentration. Then Dr. Voss called back with 2 spare rooms above her carriage house and a single practical instruction: bring the boxes first. Pride can arrive later. The offer saved more than my logistics. It reminded me that the family was not the only structure wealthy enough to shape outcomes when it decided that truth mattered. That temporary move became another emotional dividing line. Carrying the archive case down the apartment stairs, I realized how often I had mistaken proximity for security. The family had given me access badges, invitations, and rooms inside buildings with their name on the stone, and I had let those things persuade me that I belonged. Yet the first time I endangered their preferred story, every borrowed doorway narrowed. Standing in Dr. Voss's guest room, surrounded by banker boxes and old notebooks, I felt stripped down to the pieces of life that were actually mine: my memory, my work, my records, my voice, and the few people who had chosen me without needing permission from the dynasty. The reduction hurt. It also made me harder to threaten. Even with evidence, the emotional cost kept rising. An aunt stopped answering messages. A cousin I loved sent a voice note begging me to think about what scandal would do to the family legacy. Former staff members avoided eye contact when they saw me in town. The wound became larger than authorship. It became a referendum on whether a woman could refuse to serve as the emotional insulation for everyone else's comfort. Some nights I stared at the journals until the ink blurred and wondered whether justice was simply another word for exhausting yourself in front of people who had already decided you were inconvenient. Then I would remember the donor wall going dark and the applause that followed, and I would know that silence would not protect my peace. It would only force me to live inside their version forever. The turning point came when Lydia obtained the internal run sheet for the final public family gathering. The family was planning a donor briefing to calm concern after whispers about the gala and the restructuring. Cameras would be limited, but the room would contain everyone whose opinion mattered: board members, legacy donors, sponsors, and the senior staff who had quietly watched the revision of history. Vivian intended to use the gathering to stabilize the narrative once and for all. To me, it looked like something else. The first stage the family had created for itself without understanding that it could be taken. I did not need to shout my truth into a hostile ballroom. I needed to walk into a room that had been prepared for reassurance and make reassurance impossible. By the eve of the briefing, my fear had simplified into resolve. I was no longer trying to win my old place back. I no longer wanted a corrected caption, amended introduction, or a seat restored through family pity. I wanted the public architecture of the lie exposed so thoroughly that no future version could be built on top of it. I wanted the family to lose control of its polished public story in front of the very people whose approval it prized most. That sentence, once only a possibility, became the private vow I carried into sleep. If the family's power had always depended on my willingness to remain legible only through them, then the most dangerous thing I could do was become unmistakably myself in a room they controlled. The morning of the donor briefing, I spread everything across my dining table and built the presentation the family had spent years preventing. I arranged the journals chronologically, clipped donor letters beside matching grant language, printed the documentary edit history, and marked the exact moment my name vanished from the final cut. I was not assembling evidence for a courtroom. I was assembling a story strong enough to survive a polished interruption. Every page had to answer a likely tactic: denial, minimization, pity, deflection, accusation. By lunchtime, the table looked less like a home and more like a counter-history of the dynasty's most marketable virtue. I also chose my witnesses carefully. Dr. Miriam Voss agreed to attend the briefing and bring the original pledge card from the pilot year. Lydia prepared to confirm the edit history if challenged, a retired program coordinator who had kept hard copy schedules from the first school visits offered to verify dates and locations. None of them were there to rescue me. That distinction mattered. For years, the family had treated my credibility as something that existed only when endorsed by a higher-ranking voice. This time, the witnesses were not a substitute for my authority. They were a structure around it, proof that truth becomes harder to bury when a woman stops carrying it alone. By mid-afternoon, Vivian made one final attempt to contain me. A black car arrived with a handwritten note inviting me to a private conversation before the briefing. The note promised dignity, healing, and an opportunity to avoid irreversible harm. I understood every word as a translation of the same old command: keep the wound private, so the family can remain public. I did not go. Instead, I sent back a short message that said only, if there is dignity available tonight, it will not come from silence. The simplicity of the sentence steadied me. I was no longer improvising from pain. I was choosing. When I entered the theater, I felt the room take inventory of me. Some faces showed relief that I had come at all. Others showed the alert discomfort reserved for women who might ruin an orderly evening by telling the truth too clearly. Oliver approached first and whispered that his mother would allow a brief personal acknowledgement if I behaved. He still believed recognition was something the family could distribute like a favor. I told him I had not come to be allowed anything. I had come to finish a sentence the family had tried to cut out of its own history. The look on his face told me he finally understood the scale of what was about to happen. Vivian opened the briefing with the same velvet authority she had used for years. She thanked donors for their patience, praised the foundation's resilience, and framed recent confusion as the predictable noise surrounding change. Then she invited Sabrina Holt to the stage as an example of fresh stewardship rooted in the founding vision. The wording was brilliant in a bloodless way. It gestured toward continuity while burying the person whose continuity made the claim possible. The room might have accepted it if I had stayed seated. Instead, I rose before the applause finished and asked for one factual correction before the foundation committed another permanent one. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the dining room after the gala. That earlier silence had been arranged against me. This one arrived because no one knew whether to stop me, and because too many people already suspected that the official version was thinner than it sounded. Vivian tried to smile me back into compliance, but I had spent days preparing for the exact pressure hidden inside polite expressions. I walked to the front row, lifted the first journal high enough for donors to see its bent spine and dated pages, and said that before anyone discussed stewardship, the room needed to know who had actually built the thing being inherited. From there, momentum became moral rather than theatrical. I did not rant. I narrated. I showed the pilot year route maps, read from the earliest donor letters, and matched those documents to later brochures that had stripped me out sentence by sentence. Lydia confirmed the documentary edits. Dr. Voss confirmed the original pledge and why it had been given. The retired coordinator confirmed the first school calendar. Each witness widened the space in which truth could breathe. Oliver tried once to say that many people had contributed, and I answered that contribution was not the same as replacement. The distinction hung in the room with the clarity of a blade. I also made sure the room understood the emotional arithmetic behind the documents. I said the family had not merely taken credit. It had counted on my love to keep the theft quiet. It had depended on the fact that daughters are trained to absorb injury rather than expose it, especially when exposure might embarrass men, donors, or the family crest above the door. The sentence changed the air. Suddenly, the briefing was no longer only about archival accuracy. It was about the old bargain wealthy families offer women. Give us your labor, your discretion, your emotional management, and in return we will let you remain near the table we still control. Several women in the audience lowered their eyes when I said it, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. That recognition multiplied the force of the evidence. A board member who had said almost nothing all evening finally asked why no one had thought to ask my permission before using my notes, images, and language in materials that now carried someone else's name. The question was so basic that the room seemed embarrassed not to have begun there. Vivian tried to answer in the abstract, invoking stewardship, transition, and the need for a unified public narrative. But abstraction had become the family's weakest instrument. After pages, dates, signatures, and witness statements, the old language sounded exactly like what it was, a refined way of describing the moment powerful people decide that the woman who built the thing is too inconvenient to remain visible inside it. By the time I reached the final page, the old hierarchy had already begun to sag. Donors were no longer looking to Vivian for cues. Staff members who had spent the week avoiding me were watching openly now, some with shame, some with relief. A board member asked why the donor wall had been changed before the briefing if the family truly believed this was a misunderstanding. Another asked who authorized the documentary revision. Those questions mattered as much as any document. They meant the room had stopped treating the family narrative as the default setting of reality. I felt the shift not as triumph, but as release. For the first time in years, I was no longer defending my own memory against a machine built to overrule it. Vivian made her last move with extraordinary discipline. She rose, thanked me for sharing my feelings, and attempted to absorb the entire exposure into a softer story about misunderstood roles inside a growing institution. But the documents on the table had already outrun the language of misunderstanding. A donor asked why a woman who had supposedly been valued was publicly erased instead of privately thanked. Another asked why the family's first response had been gossip about my mental state. The theater was no longer a place where performance could outrank sequence. It had become a room full of adults watching power fail to explain itself. Oliver broke before his mother did. He admitted that he had known the donor wall would be changed, though he claimed he had not expected it to happen so harshly. He admitted that he had asked me to sign the statement. He admitted, in a voice too low for heroism and too audible for escape, that the family had believed I would choose loyalty over exposure, because I always had before. The confession was imperfect, self-protective, and late. It was also enough. I did not need him to become noble. I only needed the room to hear that the plan had been deliberate and that my silence had been assumed as part of the architecture. Then came the apology Vivian had been saving for a safer audience. She offered it with elegant sorrow, speaking of family strain, heavy responsibilities, and the pain of seeing private conflicts spill into public view. She said the foundation would be happy to restore my title, review the documentary, and discuss an internal acknowledgement of my early work. Every phrase was designed to return the power of naming to the same hands that had abused it. I understood that accepting the offer would allow the dynasty to present the evening as a difficult but resolved misunderstanding. It would give them back the right to decide how much of me they were willing to see. I refused gently and in full view of everyone. I said I was not there to negotiate re-entry into a story that had required my disappearance in order to function. I said the program should continue, but it would continue without my silence. I said the journals, letters, and early plans would be archived independently so that no future campaign could rewrite the beginning again. Finally, I said that recognition meant nothing if it arrived only after exposure made denial inconvenient. The boundary landed harder than anger would have. Rage can be dismissed as volatility. A calm woman declining the terms of her own restoration is much more difficult for a powerful family to survive. When the briefing ended, people did not rush first to Vivian. They crossed the room toward me. Some came to apologize for what they had chosen not to see. Some came with questions about the records. Some came simply to stand near the truth now that it had a public shape. Lydia squeezed my hand once and said, "They cannot put you back in the wall now." That absurd, perfect sentence made me laugh for the first time in days. The laugh felt foreign and clean. It did not heal everything the family had taken, but it proved that the wound no longer dictated the entire future. The public consequences began before I even reached the lobby. Two donors quietly informed the board chair that any future campaign would require an independent archive review and written corrections to the foundation's origin materials. A senior staff member asked whether the communications office should suspend the documentary rollout immediately. Someone else requested that the donor wall remain dark until the record was corrected rather than relit with another half-truth. A younger program manager, voice shaking but steady enough, said the staff needed written guidance by morning because nobody wanted to spend another week repeating a lie that had just collapsed in public. None of those actions restored the years I had lost, but each one mattered because it forced accountability to become operational instead of sentimental. The dynasty could still protect itself in 100 small ways, yet it could no longer pretend that the evening had produced only a family misunderstanding. It had produced administrative consequences, witness memory, and a paper trail that no graceful statement could unmake. Later, when I stepped out into the night with the archive case in my hand, the city felt quieter than it had after the gala. Not kinder, not magically repaired, just cleaner, because the lie had finally been forced into daylight where it could not keep breeding inside closed rooms. I had chosen recognition on my own terms, and the family had lost the ability to restore the old order by pretending nothing had happened. I did not go back to the family estate, the donor wall, or the private dining room where my place had once been assigned for me. I did not stop to see whether anyone from the family might chase me into the street with a softer version of the same old bargain. I went home, opened the oldest journal to the first page, and wrote one new line beneath the original date, Tonight, they learned that removal is not the same as disappearance. Then I sat there long enough to feel my body unclench, hearing nothing but the scratch of my own pen, and finally realizing that the story would no longer need their permission to exist. The sentence steadied my breathing, slowed my pulse, and made the whole brutal week finally feel survivable. That was the justice I could trust, because it belonged to me before anyone else tried to name it. In the weeks that followed, the family would still scramble to soften the damage, but they would never again control the first sentence spoken about who built that legacy. I knew then that silence would never protect me again.